When you think of video game worlds that completely pull you in, Bethesda is one of the first names that comes to mind. They gave us The Elder Scrolls. They revived Fallout. They brought Doom back from the dead, and now they're shaping whole galaxies with Starfield. But behind all of those legendary titles is a company that's been through just about everything. Lawsuits, near bankruptcy, corporate takeovers, and fan backlash. Bethesda has built entire universes from the ground up, but their story is just as dramatic. This is the rise, fall, and reinvention of Bethesda. Bethesda's story starts in 1986, but it doesn't start with video games. It begins with a tech engineer named Christopher Weaver. Before founding Bethesda Softworks, Christopher Weaver was a technology forecaster and communications engineer in the television and cable industries. After finishing graduate school, he eventually became the chief engineer for the U.S. House Energy Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, where he influenced legislation that affected the telephone, television, and cable industries. In the meantime, Chris also founded Video Magic Laboratories with a friend from MIT, and they authored and assembled a 400-page business plan to commercialize their prior lab work, and came in contact with a wealthy family in the electronics industry that provided Video Magic with financing. The company developed several technologies, including location-based entertainment systems that Chris deemed cutting edge. However, it didn't bring back much of a return. And unfortunately, the funding family, having financial issues of its own, dropped out of the venture and sold off some of Video Magic's properties. After leaving the House Subcommittee some years later, Chris established Media Technology Associates Limited, renamed to Media Technology Limited in March of 1988. The company provided engineering and media consulting for private companies and government organizations. And at Media Technology, Chris worked with Ed Fletcher, an electrical engineer whom he collaborated with at Video Magic, and together they worked on games for Laserdisc-based systems, until that industry crashed in 1984. While waiting for potential new contracts, the company acquired an Amiga personal computer with which the two began to experiment with. Ed was a fan of American football, and suggested that they develop a football game for the system, which Chris supported despite having no interest in the sport. Ed developed the game, later named Gridiron, out of Chris's house in Bethesda, Maryland, in roughly 9 months. His initial approach was to use lookup tables to map player inputs to predetermined outcomes. However, Chris disliked this concept, and they designed a more realistic, physics-based system. Chris then formed Bethesda Softworks on the kitchen table of his Bethesda home as a division of Media Technology on June 28, 1986. The formation was described as an experiment to see if the PC market was a viable place to develop games. Chris had originally named the company Softwork, but found that the name was taken by a company based in Virginia. Chris reached out to the owner of that company, and they both agreed to coexist rather than fight over the title. And this is when the name of the company transformed into Bethesda Softworks. Unlike Video Magic, Bethesda was entirely self-funded, starting with roughly $100,000, and was not attached to any business plan. Gridiron was released as the company's first game later in 1986 for the Amiga, Atari ST, and Commodore 64 systems. The game sold out almost instantly, and it proved that even a tiny independent developer could make a hit if the idea was strong enough. EA even took notice, and the two companies briefly worked together, but the relationship went south fast. EA was working on the first John Madden football game and hired Bethesda to help finish developing it, and acquired distribution rights for future versions of Gridiron. But in June of 1988, after no new cross-console version of Gridiron had been released, Bethesda stopped work on the project and sued EA for $7.3 million, claiming EA halted the release while incorporating many of its elements into Madden. The case was settled quickly, but it showed everyone one thing. This small studio from Maryland wasn't afraid to stand up to the biggest names in gaming. Fun fact, Courtney Cox, later known for her role in the sitcom Friends, actually worked at the publisher briefly in the 1980s. By the end of the 80s, Bethesda had built a reputation as a small but ambitious team that preferred realism in systems over flash and style. That same mindset would soon lead them to something much bigger. In 1990, Bethesda moved to Rockville, Maryland, where they still operate today. And here, they experimented with projects of all kinds, from licensed Terminator games to software tools. But in 1994, they released the game that would define their future, The Elder Scrolls Arena. It was rough around the edges, but players loved the freedom. Arena let you go anywhere, talk to anyone, and pretty much live inside the world. It really was unlike anything else at the time. 2 years later, Bethesda released Daggerfall, and it was massive. Entire cities, randomized dungeons, day and night cycles. It was a technical marvel for its time, but all of that ambition came at a cost. The game was buggy and hard to run on most PCs. Then, things started to spiral. In the late 90s, spin-off games like Battlespire and Redguard didn't sell well, and for the first time, Bethesda's future was in real danger. The company was running out of money, morale was low, and a bankruptcy filing was not off the table. But that's when Christopher Weaver made a move that completely changed everything. In 1999, Christopher teamed up with a lawyer and businessman, Robert Altman, to create a new parent company called ZeniMax Media. The idea was to give Bethesda a financial safety net, a structure that could keep the company alive while also giving it room to grow. ZeniMax became the umbrella that handled the finances, legal work, and big picture decisions, while Bethesda just focused on making and publishing games. That same year, Peter Hines joined the company to handle marketing, a role that would make him one of the most recognizable faces of Bethesda for decades. And by 2001, Bethesda had officially split into two divisions: Bethesda Game Studios, which handled development, and Bethesda Softworks, which handled publishing. But internal tensions grew, and in 2002, Chris Weaver stopped being employed by ZeniMax, and later filed a lawsuit against ZeniMax claiming he was ousted by his new business partners after giving them access to his brand and was owed $1.2 million in severance pay. ZeniMax filed counterclaims and moved to dismiss the case, claiming Chris had gone through emails of other employees to find evidence. This dismissal was later vacated on appeal and the parties settled out of court, and Chris Weaver remained a major shareholder in the company. This wasn't Bethesda's only bit of controversy either. In 2001, Bethesda published Echelon in the US, a video game developed by a Russian development studio called Madia, and Madia stated that Bethesda did not pay for box sales of the game as was allegedly specified in the contract. The developers at Madia also wrote an open letter to Bethesda in which they detailed the affair, but Bethesda refused to pay. In the end, Madia decided not to take it to court, and Pete Hines stated that Madia presented misleading allegations about Bethesda's role as a publisher of Echelon in North America, and that Bethesda had no contractual obligations to Madia. But aside from this controversy, something big was on the horizon.
American way of life. Isn't it grand? Peace, freedom, and bacon and eggs. Seems perfect. But what if it's not?
In 2004, Bethesda made one of its smartest acquisitions in gaming history. It bought the Fallout IP from Interplay, and from there, they spent the next 4 years rebuilding it from the ground up, transforming a cult classic isometric RPG into a fully 3D open-world adventure. And when Fallout 3 launched in 2008, it was a massive success. Critics loved it, fans obsessed over it, and Bethesda officially became one of the biggest names in the industry. And they weren't done. The company expanded its publishing arm, acquiring Star Trek rights, funding new projects, and in 2009, purchasing ID Software, the legendary studio behind Doom and Quake. With Elder Scrolls, Fallout, and Doom all under one roof, Bethesda had essentially built an empire, and they went from a single studio developer to a global publisher with offices around the world. But even empires faced pressure from their own success. And for Bethesda, not everything was smooth during the early 2010s. In September of 2009, Bethesda Softworks sued Interplay Entertainment over Fallout trademark infringement. Remember how I mentioned Bethesda acquired the rights to Fallout earlier? Well, it's not that simple. I won't cover the whole legal case, because Bethesda versus Interplay could honestly be an entirely separate video, but in 2004, Interplay was faced with growing debts and declining revenues, so they offered a number of their intellectual property rights, including Fallout, to other developers and publishers for sale or license. Among the bidders for the Fallout license was Bethesda, who secured the license to create 3 Fallout titles. However, the deal was not enough to secure Interplay's future, and on November 29, 2006, Interplay was issued an involuntary bankruptcy order. But this wasn't the end for Interplay, and the next day they announced plans for Fallout Online, a game they hoped to fund with investment from European backers. Continuing to seek more funding, Interplay ended up selling the entire Fallout franchise to Bethesda through an asset purchase agreement replacing the 3-game license. And this obviously caused issues when Interplay continued working on Fallout Online. Eventually, after a lengthy legal battle, the lawsuit was settled in January of 2012, with Interplay receiving $2 million, while Bethesda gained the right to develop a Fallout MMO, as well as the rights to Fallout, Fallout 2, and Fallout Tactics: Brotherhood of Steel after December 31st, 2013. But this wouldn't be Bethesda's only legal battle. A couple of years later, in September of 2011, Bethesda's parent company, ZeniMax Media, filed a lawsuit against Mojang, the studio behind Minecraft, claiming that Mojang's planned trademark of the title Scrolls infringed on Bethesda's trademark of the Elder Scrolls series. On October 18th, Marcus Persson announced that Mojang had won the interim injunction, and in March of 2012, Mojang and Bethesda reached a settlement in which Mojang would not trademark Scrolls, but Bethesda would not contest Mojang's naming of Scrolls, so long as it would not be a direct competitor against the Elder Scrolls. But aside from a few lawsuits, Bethesda was building momentum, and they were publishing hit after hit: Dishonored, Wolfenstein: The New Order, The Evil Within, and eventually the Doom reboot in 2016. They also began branching into mobile and free-to-play games. Fallout Shelter launched as a surprise at E3 2015 and became a global hit overnight. But not everything landed perfectly. Games like Prey and Dishonored: Death of the Outsider earned critical praise, but didn't match the sales of Fallout or Skyrim. And speaking of Skyrim, its success was so overwhelming that it started to overshadow literally anything else Bethesda touched. And at this point, the studio was becoming known for building massive worlds, but also for buggy launches, slow updates, and an old engine that was beginning to show its age. Still, during this time, Bethesda was at the top of the world, but few could have predicted how fast that reputation would crack. When Bethesda announced Fallout 76, fans were curious, but cautious. An online multiplayer Fallout? It seemed like a bold idea, but unfortunately, it just didn't work. At launch, Fallout 76 was riddled with bugs, server problems, and missing features, which quickly frustrated fans and the media tore it apart. Then came the PR disasters, broken collector's editions, refund issues, and even a customer data leak through the support portal. It became one of the roughest launches in Bethesda's history and left a pretty lasting dent in their reputation. For the first time, people began to question whether Bethesda had lost its magic touch. After this, the studio still continued to publish strong titles, such as Rage 2 or Doom Eternal, but the damage from Fallout 76 did linger. But nobody could have predicted what happened next. In September of 2020, Microsoft announced it was buying ZeniMax Media, the parent company of Bethesda, for $7.5 billion, which was one of the biggest gaming acquisitions in history, an instant power move that sent shockwaves through the industry. And at first, fans wondered what it meant. Would Bethesda games become Xbox exclusives? Would the studio keep its independence? Would Microsoft fix what was broken or break what was working? We don't know. When the deal closed in March 2021, Xbox boss Phil Spencer promised Bethesda would still run semi-independently, but almost everyone knew that things wouldn't be the same. and honestly, it looked like Game Pass was now becoming the center of the Bethesda universe. Still, some commitments had to be honored. Deathloop and Ghostwire Tokyo were already locked in as PS5 exclusives under previous contracts. So yes, Bethesda, now owned by Microsoft, was still shipping games, first on Sony hardware. Then, in early 2023, they dropped a bombshell. Out of nowhere, Bethesda shadow-released Hi-Fi Rush from Tango Gameworks. No teaser, no leaks, just a trailer, a launch, and instant buzz. The game exploded online. Players loved its rhythm-based combat, colorful art, and old-school charm. It was everything people didn't expect from a modern Bethesda, polished, creative, and fun from start to finish. In one day, Tango Gameworks had become the studio everybody was rooting for, but the celebration didn't last long. A few months later, Bethesda launched Redfall, developed by Arcane Austin, and the expectations were set high. This was the studio behind Prey and Dishonored, two cult classics. But Redfall wasn't just disappointing, it was a disaster. Bugs, repetitive gameplay, and it just looked unfinished. Fans tore it apart online, and quickly the game became a symbol of everything wrong with modern AAA gaming. Even Phil Spencer admitted in interviews that they let a lot of people down. But even through all the backlash, Bethesda still had one card left to play: Starfield, their first original universe in over 25 years. The pressure was enormous, and it wasn't just another release. It was a test of whether Bethesda still had it. And they did. Within hours of early access, Starfield hit over 230,000 concurrent players on Steam, and within days, it had over 10 million players across Xbox and PC, the biggest launch in Bethesda's history. And although it wasn't perfect, no Bethesda game ever is, and it was proof that the studio could still build a world that people wanted to live in. But behind the scenes, the ground was already starting to shift. In May of 2024, the industry woke up to news that no one wanted to hear. Microsoft had begun restructuring Bethesda's studios, and the results were brutal. Arcane Austin, Tango Gameworks, and AlphaDog Games were shut down, and Roundhouse Studios was merged into ZeniMax Online. And not only that, but Bethesda and ZeniMax Media have also been accused of attempting a hostile acquisition of Human Head Studios, as well as a successful hostile acquisition of Arcane Studios before that. According to a report from IGN, ZeniMax started purposefully failing Human Head's project milestones so that they would not get paid, allowing ZeniMax to buy the company at a reduced rate, and they were accused of doing the same thing to Arcane Studios, although in Arcane's case, the studio gave in and allowed themselves to be bought. And ultimately, the failed hostile acquisition of Human Head Studios led to the cancellation of Human Head's Prey 2, according to the report. Bethesda also pressured developer No Matter Games to change the name of their game, Pray for the Gods, to Pray for the Gods, throwing an A into the name, as Bethesda felt that the initial title infringed upon trademark of their own game, Prey. Fans were furious, especially after seeing Tango Gameworks closed barely a year after Hi-Fi Rush had become one of Xbox's most praised exclusives, and developers across the industry called it a gut punch. Even Dinga Bakaba, director at Arcane Lion, publicly criticized the decision, calling it a fucking stab in the back. Social media filled with disbelief. How could a company with record Game Pass revenue and record profits shut down the very teams that had delivered success? For many fans, this wasn't just another corporate move, it was a sign of what modern gaming had become. Studios were now just chess pieces in a larger corporate game, and even when they made something brilliant, it wasn't always enough to survive. But then, in one of the strangest twists, hope came from an unexpected place. In August of 2024, Krafton, the company behind PUBG, announced it had acquired Tango Gameworks and the rights to Hi-Fi Rush. And just months after being shut down, the studio was brought back from the dead. And for fans who loved Hi-Fi Rush, it was a bittersweet win, and a reminder that passion projects still mattered, even in a world ruled by spreadsheets and shareholder calls. Meanwhile, Bethesda's core teams continued to push forward under Microsoft's umbrella, but the message was clear. This was no longer the same company that grew from a Maryland living room. This was corporate Bethesda, a key pillar of Xbox's strategy, bigger than ever, but not entirely in control of its own destiny. Nearly 4 decades after it began, Bethesda's story still isn't finished. They've survived lawsuits, near bankruptcies, broken launches, and now the chaos of corporate consolidation. From Arena to Starfield, they've built worlds that defined entire generations of players. Yes, their games are messy, they might be buggy, and they might crash every now and then, but they also inspire millions to explore. Even now, under Microsoft, that creative spark still flickers. The next Elder Scrolls is on the horizon, and a new Fallout revival has captured attention thanks to the Amazon Prime series. Bethesda isn't the same scrappy studio it once was, but maybe that's the point. They've evolved from a small experimental team into a global brand, and their journey mirrors the industry itself. Wild ambition, massive success, and inevitable corporate control. But through it all, they've endured, because for every bug and every glitch, there's still that magic moment where you step out of the vault, or look across the mountain, or blast off into the stars, and you realize that no matter how many times Bethesda stumbles, they still know how to make you feel something. And that's the legacy of Bethesda, and it's why, no matter how many times they fall, they will always find a way to rise again. What's your favorite Bethesda memory? Drop a comment down below. Also, if you enjoy gaming history and gaming deep dives, like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a future upload. This is West Coast Ninja, signing out. I will see you in the next video.